All right, I'm pleased to say I'm talking today with David Sheen, who is visiting the United States from Israel, and he's an investigative journalist there. We're going to get something about his history and his work. He's been living in Israel since 1999, I believe. Tell us, you went to Israel in 1999. Why did you do that? Why did you go? You were originally from Canada.
Yeah, that's true.
And you come from, you told me, a Zionist family. Is that correct? Yeah. So that explains some of it, I think. But
Sure,
go ahead.
Sure. Well, I mean,
What?
the truth is, I'd been to Israel many times before. My dad was born in Israel. His parents were born in Israel, so it wasn't out of the blue or anything. I'd gone there many times, spent summers with my family and cousins and uncles and aunts and grandparents. So it wasn't out of nowhere. But you mentioned yourself having spent some time up in Canada, so you probably have a sense of how damn cold that country is.
Yes, well, that's true. I'm originally Canadian, so I'm originally from Alberta, where it's very cold there. Yeah, right. That's true.
So, I mean, truthfully, I think that anyone should be able to migrate anywhere in the world. For me, I had those two passports. I had both Canadian and Israeli passports, so I could. And I did.
Because your family, why is that?
Because I'm the son of an Israeli, so
I
was an Israeli born abroad.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I inherited that citizenship. Although it's true that Jewish people, according to Israeli law, can become Israeli citizens instantaneously upon arrival. But I was already born Israeli Canadian Israeli. But yeah, I'd spent time there with my family. And on teen tours and such. But that was the first time in 1999 when I had to kind of experience it in my own right as an individual, not buffered by or constrained and by external I had to navigate society on my own and realize what it was for myself, and that was a really interesting came front to face with reality, realizing that maybe the country isn't exactly like I was taught it is, and maybe it's not exactly what the media says that it is, and of course it took time for all the pieces to fall into place, and but certainly that was a rude awakening, and now
before we talk about your observation about what was happening in Israel.
Sure.
In Canada, you studied in Canada. You went to York University, I believe. In Toronto?
That's right.
In Toronto, Ontario. And were you left to go to Israel when you were in your 20s?
Yeah.
How old were you when you went?
25.
25, yeah. 25. And so were you involved at all politically in Canada? Did you observe things that were happening, or was there anything that you were concerned about in Canada at all?
Certainly. I mean, I can tell you. I'm not often asked about this. It's interesting, but for me, one of my most formative memories of Canada was when I was 18 years old, and I was just starting out at university at York, and I remember that there was an anti-racist protest downtown. I guess at that point the neo-Nazi movement was burgeoning in Toronto, and the government at that time was charging them with some kind of hate crime. And so the neo-Nazis in Toronto organized a march down the biggest street in Canada, Yonge Street. And then they marched to City Hall, where there were courts. And then, of course, anti-racist groups had organized a counter-protest, rather. And so I was participating in the counter-protest. And when I got there, I saw how the neo-Nazis were engulfed by, if there were 50 neo-Nazis, there were 50 policemen protecting them. And then they, on their mounted horses, they strode up to the anti-racists, and with zero or next to zero provocation, they just whipped out their billy clubs and started beating the anti-racist protesters. And I remember, and then of course the next day, the police services board, they dismissed it. They said there would be no investigation into the violence that occurred there. And
why? Oh, sorry.
No, it's
go
okay.
Ahead.
It's
go
okay.
ahead.
But I mean, up until that point, in my teens, I remember, listening to hip hop, listening to rap music, listening to NWA, hearing songs like F the Police, and hearing these stories about police brutality in the United States mainly. And I guess without any experience of my own, I'd never been to Los Angeles, South Central, and so I didn't know for myself. But I guess my sense was, oh, that's a little cartoonish. I'm sure that it's not perfect in LA, but it seems like those stories are a bit exaggerated. I wasn't clear on how real they were. And then, when I saw this in, supposedly polite Canada, how the police there, without shame too, after they started beating people, they were like giving each other high fives and like bowing, taking gladly when people were saying shame, shame, how could you do such a thing? And they were like bowing to the assembled crowd in front of them. And it made me realize that there wasn't any shame about it, that police identified with far-right groups and hated leftist protesters. And I thought, wow, if these mainly white kids protesting racism catch this much heat from the police, then imagine what people of color actually face. Wow, those hip-hop songs aren't exaggerating. They must be telling only a fraction of the story. It must be even worse than they say. And so that was kind of from one of my memories from Canada and my political awakening, so to speak. Wow. So I was involved in some anti-racist organizing there.
So that was sort of an initiation in some ways to understanding this issue of racism, of the ongoing, it seems to me, eruption of Nazi sentiments. We can't seem to get rid of this somehow. But anyway, so then you went to Israel, and so what? And it wasn't, you expected it to be somewhat of a paradise, or is that right? Or what did you expect in Israel?
Wow, it's hard to recall exactly what was going through my mind or my heart at that point. But, I'd had pretty universally positive experiences as a youth, growing up.
When you visited
Exactly,
Israel.
exactly. Surrounded by family members who loved me and cared about me and who were very warm and still are, and so that was my experience. And also I think that there were some things that growing up in Canada where people are very polite, but sometimes maybe that politeness also acts as a barrier to real intimacy. Maybe I, felt like, well, in the Middle East, people are more honest and open about what they think. I like that. I like that honesty, So I guess the grass is always greener on the other side. After having lived there for a bunch of years, I went, oh my God, you kind of feel like a Canadian when you're in Israel, and you feel like an Israeli when you're in Canada, and you kind of miss some of that politeness. I wish people were more polite, but certainly that wasn't the worst of it. I'd never really known Palestinian people growing up in Toronto, even though it's super multicultural. I knew Muslim people, but they were mainly from Pakistan, and I knew some Arab folk, but they were mainly Lebanese. So I never really knew any Palestinians, and then until I actually moved to Israel. And then just from ordinary life, living in Tel Aviv, I just gradually started to meet some here and there. Mainly the building that I was living in, it was getting some renovations done. So the construction workers were Palestinian. I would just say, hey, how's it going? Talk to them as I was going in and out of the building. And gradually the hey, how's it going turned into, hey, have a smoke. Hey, have a cup of coffee. Hey, come eat lunch with us. And just over time, I started to realize that their lives were circumscribed by these rules that had no justification in any security logic, that they had to get up or leave the house before 4 a.m. just to get to the job site in Tel Aviv, which probably could have been 40-minute drive away, but they would have to leave hours in advance just to go through this complicated bureaucratic apparatus, not because they represented any security threat, but it seemed to me in order to keep them as an easily exploitable workforce. And this wasn't a temporary situation designed to solve one security problem or another, but this was like the perpetual situation that these people were held in. And then all of a sudden, all these security justifications that I'd heard growing up, that I'd accepted as legitimate, growing up as a PEP, progressive except for Palestine, being anti-racist, but, in terms of Israel, forgiving it for its treatment of Palestinians because, well, they need to protect themselves, but all of a sudden realizing, well, this isn't about protection. This is about holding these people as a workforce that they can exploit.
What made you realize that?
Well, like I was saying, that they just there was no the fact they were in Israel. They had spent every day in Israel. There was no security reason why they were being prevented from entering, And now if you'd say like maybe, for some temporary period of time, that's one thing, but this was permanent. The fact that they look, I can easily understand why you have if that's a situation where you're preventing people from having equal rights, don't do it. Don't do it. Get Jewish construction workers. If you only want Jews in your country, you don't want anyone else, you're afraid of other people that aren't, if you're deciding that someone is safe or not safe based upon their ethnicity, I think that's a very incorrect way of going about having immigration procedures. But if that's what you think, then at least follow it to the letter and hire Jewish people. And if you have to pay them more, then pay them more. But don't bring in laborers saying, oh, well, we can't trust them to just have equal rights. We have to circumscribe their legal rights. And then just don't do that, or then acknowledge you're an apartheid state. And this logic is, extended also to the latest group of non-Jewish people living in the country, the African refugees. In the last 10 years, you've seen about 66,000 African folks, mainly from Sudan and Eritrea, but not only, but mainly from those two countries, fleeing genocide in Darfur and fleeing, autocratic regime in Eritrea. So people come seeking refuge, and the government decides we don't want them here because they're non-white, non-Jews. And it starts rounding them into camps with the stated intention of making their lives miserable so that they self-deport, rounding them to camps where they can't do anything all day because they don't want them in the country, because they want racial purity. Now, okay, of course I'm extremely opposed to that idea that any benefit can come from being racially pure. But if that's the logic of the state, then at least abide by it. Say, we don't want any African people, and don't take any African goods. There's no sugar that's grown in Israel. There's no coffee that's grown in Israel. You know what I'm saying? There's no chocolate, no gold, no diamonds that are mined there. All those minerals that go into your cell phone, those all come from Africa. So if the Israeli government doesn't want any African people, okay. I find it reprehensible, but if that's really what you believe, then don't take any of these African goods and services or minerals and resources.
And Israel's not going to agree to that.
I find it hard to believe. So so that's what it came to. That was kind of really, it was, so in any case, it was, I guess you could say, seeing the economic reality, the unequal economic reality, that made me realize that the so-called security justifications were bogus, and that it was in fact like racial supremacy, and that was the underlying logic of the state, and that kind of caused my break with Zionism. And of course it took a few more years for everything to fall into place, but that was how it happened for me in any case.
So these workers, the Israelis are using them, though. They're laborers.
Are we talking about Palestinian folks or African refugees?
I'm talking about Africans.
Okay.
So talking about Africa.
Okay. So the government, essentially has tried to make their lives a living hell. And so one of the ways it does that is by not giving them work permits. Now, of course, you'll say some European countries also don't do that. Well, that's true. But then they give remittances to people. They're like, okay, we don't want you to compete with our workforce, but you need to live. You're a refugee. You need to have refuge. So here's a free, here's housing. Here's a stipend. So you can at least afford to feed your family. The other way they do it is like, okay, we're not going to give you any benefits, but you're allowed to work so you can support yourselves. The Israeli government said, we're not going to do either. We're not going to give you any help to support yourselves, any goods and services, and we're not going to even allow you to work to support yourselves. So, of course, people have to eke by so they can find work on the black market. And, of course, that means that they can be exploited even worse than the average manual laborer, because you don't have to abide by labor laws necessarily if it's all under the table. So people often are exploited. What choice do they have? And so it's very tragic. Of course, besides the cycles of poverty, like driving people also into prostitution when they don't have many options. And in a lot of cases, these are women who were raped or gang raped on the way there, because often when they were fleeing their home countries and the ethnic cleansings going on there, they were often kidnapped by human traffickers who then exploited them and ransomed them for money. And while they were doing so, would torture them and rape them. And so a lot of these people are rape victims and torture victims, and that you'd think that after everything they suffered, even just being a refugee to begin with, but then even after being a refugee and having to suffer through all these tortures, that they would arrive in the country and be the first thing that would happen would be the welcome mat, and people would wash their feet and say, "Thank you for coming. We're so happy to provide a safe haven for you. We Jewish people, of all people, know what it's like to be a refugee, to be despised, and to not be given safe haven when we need it most. So we of all people should understand that, and now we have an opportunity to live by a higher moral code and to live by an Abrahamic moral code if they see themselves as religious people, and to open our tent to strangers." But in fact, just the opposite occurred. Of course, it wasn't perfect at first, but it wasn't as bad as when the government started ramping up the racism. The government would start inciting against them, saying, "Oh, these people are criminals, and they're rapists, and they're diseased," and all this rhetoric. You of course you find this in other places, including here in the United States.
Exactly.
This anti-refugee.
This is one of the rationales, or the number of rationales they're giving for not allowing them into the country. Right?
Yes, exactly. All these, of course, for some people who are who own their racism, they don't mind saying, "No, I don't like them here because they're not white, non-Jews, and I don't want them here, and I don't want them marrying my daughter. I don't want them," So for some people, they'll just be straight up about their racist motives. For other people, of course, they'll couch it in other terms. They'll assign to them supposed they're incorrigible rapists or something like this. This is a familiar racist rhetoric, and so then people, of course, started absorbing this, and then we start seeing race rallies and race riots in Tel Aviv.
Well, let me ask you this, David, and I want to tell our listeners again that we're talking with David Sheen, who is an investigative journalist in Israel, and he's been in Israel since 1999. You were talking about various folks coming from Eritrea and Somalia and other parts of Africa where there's been just, enormous problems. And so are you saying essentially that none of these folks are able to work at all in Israel?
Well, as I said, the government makes it as difficult as possible for them. At the same time, there's this even the Israeli police will say, look, they'll tell the government, if you do not allow these people to work at all, then they will have no choice but to turn to crime in order to support themselves. So you're shooting yourself in the foot. So the government, realizing this, they created a little loophole. The visas that they have say they're not allowed to work, but the Supreme Court issued, again, we're going into kind of minute detail, but the Supreme Court said, well, it instructed employers to ignore that sentence on their visas saying that they're not allowed to work. So even though their visas say they're not allowed to work, the Supreme Court has given a ruling saying that order should be ignored. So technically, legally, they can work, and they must work. They need to eat. But of course, how many options are open to them? I'll give you an example. About a year, 2 years ago, there was an advertisement placed in an Israeli publication that was telling people, do you need housekeeping work? Do you need someone to clean your household or your office? We provide these services. And we have a menu here, and you can choose. If you want a white Jewish woman to clean your house, then this is how much it costs per hour. If you want a non-Jewish white person to clean your house, then this is how much it costs per hour, less. And then if you want a black woman to clean your house, then it would cost even less to do so. So, disgusting. It's just one example, but it's an example that speaks to the whole, which is that the way that black people are seen in Israel, and certainly non-Jewish black people are seen in Israel as, subhuman. And they're often treated as such, sadly. It's very commonplace for people to start screaming at people, yelling at people, even children, swearing at them, racial epithets. If you're sitting someone comes on the bus, people will not sit beside them or tell them to stand or say, open the window, it smells like shit in here, it smells, kinds of stuff that maybe you experienced in the 1930s. I don't know, of course I didn't live in the 1930s, but it often feels to me like going back in a time machine, because I never imagined growing up in the 70s and 80s, I never imagined that in my lifetime I would see this anywhere in the world, and certainly not in Israel. Couldn't have fathomed it. that I would see it in my lifetime.
Some of us who are involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the 1990s and the 1980s, that includes me, we would hear every now and then about apartheid in Israel. So is it somewhat like that?
You know,
would you say? Or
So,
I mean,
go ahead.
deliberate laws that will separate. It sounds like it's not quite that, but the discrimination is there. But anyway, please explain.
Well, there's de jure and de facto discrimination. There's both. There's both legal and extra legal. You know, so in terms of the comparison, of course, I've never lived under South African apartheid, so it's difficult for me to speak to it. But something I say that I noticed the one time I was in Africa and I went to the Apartheid Museum. I talk about this in my current lecture that I'm going to be giving tonight at Spelman College. I talk about how when you get to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, that they have a wall. Now, on this wall, there's 121 plaques, and these plaques all state the name of a law that was part of the apartheid system. And when I saw this, I was blown away, because I guess in my naivete, I never realized. I guess I'd always assumed that there was one apartheid law, the apartheid law, that the South African Congress or Parliament passed this law, and then from then on there was apartheid. This law instituted it, and I didn't really realize, of course, that it's not one law; it's over 100 laws, and that altogether these laws, each in their own field, create a matrix that is the apartheid system. Once I realized that, I realized, well, we don't have to determine if it's 100%, if Israel is exactly like South Africa or completely different. It's not going to have all the same laws. It's its own entity. But we can look at that list of 121 laws and say, okay, how many of these laws exist in Israel? Is it 30 of them? Is it 40 or 50 or 60 or 70? I don't know. I haven't done that calculus. But if someone wants to find out, is it like South Africa? That's the experiment you can run. But regarding the question of whether it's racist, it's hella racist, you know, and some of it is legislated. So there's over 50 laws, at least, that specifically different treatment, how people are treated differently, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. If you're Jewish, you have extra rights and privileges. If you're not Jewish, you have fewer rights and privileges. But of course, in addition to the legal ways that people are discriminated, and there's also the unofficial discrimination. Like, for example, there's no law that says people have to be separated at the swimming pool, but there's all kinds of towns in Israel that don't allow non-Jewish people to swim in their public pools. And some of these, the mayors of these towns, or the politics of these towns, are supposedly centrist. You know, what do you make of that? So I can give you a million different examples. We can talk all day about it, but the point is...
What if you're African and Jewish?
Black Jews is a very good question. So some people may already know that in Israel there are about 140,000, between 1% and 2% of the population approximately. It's about the same amount of part of the population that's Jewish here in the United States, about between 1% and 2%, let's say. And so 140,000 Jews, mainly from Ethiopia, and they immigrated in the 80s, most of them, and some in the 90s. And, it's a really, really interesting story about them. Of course, they don't suffer from Jewish supremacy. They aren't treated any less different because they are themselves Jewish, but they suffer from white supremacy. They are, of course, there's shadism, there's pigmentocracy. The less pigment you have, the more privileges you have, just like other places where white supremacy is the norm. And in Israel, of course, there's fair-skinned Jews and darker-skinned Jews, and of the Jewish communities in Israel, the Ethiopians are the darkest skinned. And so they certainly suffer from white supremacy. They're often sent to different schools, often sent to different neighborhoods. And in addition to that, the most disgusting aspect of their immigration story is that for many of them, for no small amount of them, their mothers were told that as a condition for being allowed to move to Israel, they were required to take long-term birth control shots that essentially sterilize them for months at a time. Now, of course, it goes without saying that no other group of Jewish people from anywhere else in the world, from the US, USSR, or any other country, no other people were required to have their fertility constrained as a condition for being allowed to move to the country.
David, when did they start that?
Well, it was just revealed a few years ago, and but what had happened was that one of the ways they noticed this was they found that all of a sudden these kindergarten classes were like their populations were reduced by half in a matter of a few years, and they started investigating how did this happen? How did these classes shrink so
And
quickly?
who started investigating?
Investigative journalists, Israeli
Like
investigative
yourself?
journalists, like myself. Yes, some of my colleagues. Thankfully, there still is a working press in Israel, as much as we're under attack. But there still are investigative journalists doing important work.
Let me ask you,
Sure.
who makes these decisions? Who would make the decision that they had to have some kind of be taking how did you call it? What did you call it?
Well, it's a drug called Depo-Provera.
Depo-Provera.
And I
so
believe
that who makes that decision? Does
it's a good question.
the Israeli go ahead?
No.
please.
I mean, well, this is what's still in question. The Israeli government claims that they're supposedly trying to get, or they were when the issue first came out. They said, "Oh, we're going to get to the bottom of this and find out, who is responsible for making these decisions. Was it the state group, or a parastate group, or a quasi-state group, or a non-state group? Who was really responsible?" Some of the immigration of Jewish people to Israel is facilitated not only by the state, but by other groups that work in conjunction with the state, like the Jewish Agency and the Joint Distribution Committee. There's various different Jewish groups globally who work hand in hand with the state. Who is ultimately responsible for making those policies? It's still amorphous. It's still unclear who exactly gave the yes, who gave the V. But in any case, no matter what, someone at some level had to approve it, and it's a symptom of across the board. Look, let's put that aside for a moment. Let's talk about Ethiopian Jews once they're already in Israel, okay?
Okay.
Police know that, okay, you woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning, you're upset because someone peed in your cornflakes, whatever. Who are you going to take that frustration out on? You'll go to a black neighborhood where Ethiopians have already been congregated into, because the state said, okay, well, let's put all those black people in the same neighborhood. So they'll go to those neighborhoods and beat up some kids because they looked at them wrong, and they know that they can get away with it because they can. Wait
a minute. So you wake up and you're frustrated. You're Jewish, and
Okay.
you're Jewish and you're white, and you wake up and you feel this way, but you want to take it out on someone, so you go to an Ethiopian community. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that almost every single black Jewish person in the country can tell you a story of police brutality. Whether it's you yourself experienced it on your skin, or whether it's your brother, or your father, or your uncle, or your cousin, or your nephew, or your niece even, but certainly amongst young black men in Israel, anyone can tell you a story of how they're treated, how they're over-policed, and how this is the issue that bothers them the most. Of course, they feel discrimination in lots of different aspects of their lives, but this is one of the issues that bothers them the most, that they're treated in this way by the police.
David, there's so much to talk about. We'll
There
continue
is.
with this, but I do want to
There is.
mention, of course,
Yeah.
that even here in Atlanta, that the police department has been sending its policemen to Israel to be trained. And I think that's true around the country. Have you looked at that at all? Do you know much about that?
Maybe what we need to see is Black Lives Matter in Atlanta doing joint trips to Israel to meet with Black Lives Matter there, because if the police forces here are trading notes, exchanging notes, and trading tactics of how to better use racist strategies of how to constrain the movements of black people, then perhaps black people themselves should also exchange notes on this.
Well, let me just mention what I've heard is that the policemen are primarily being trained about the Israeli treatment of Palestinians, not so much what they're doing within the country, but it seems as if there's some very parallel issues here. So as far as the treatment of black folks, for sure. So, right?
Yeah. No, look,
So-
what we've seen in the last few years, for many decades, every once in a while you'd have this protest by Ethiopian Jews complaining about state racism towards them, and then the government would come in and say, "Oh, we've heard your cries, we'll do something about this. Oh, it's a sad story, we won't let this pass." And then, of course, that was just an excuse to get them to silence them. And then after several more years, again, there's some incident, some other viral video of a police person beating a black man, and then people remember again that yes, there's massive state racism, and people go out into the streets, and then they keep trying to silence them. It seems that this last protest wave, for the first time, people aren't going to be easily silenced. That they're staying in this, maybe not staying in the streets, but at least the conversation continues. They realize that whatever the state tells them, they're not to be believed. And so for the first time, maybe you have Ethiopian folks who, if until now they kind of adhered to the Zionist narrative and were hesitant to abandon it, you see for the first time saying, well, damn, these cops are beating me up for no reason. And then we see them in the media afterwards justifying their own brutalities. Well, if they're playing us that way, then maybe what they've been telling us about the Palestinians all these years is also a crock. Maybe all these justifications that they've used to convince us to be on side when they, beat Palestinian people undeservingly, maybe that was also a bunch of garbage, and maybe we shouldn't allow ourselves to be lulled into being co-opted by that.
Let me get some demographics here.
Okay.
So we're talking about Africans being in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
How many? I'd like to have a feel
Sure.
for the different groups. You've mentioned
Sure.
it somewhat, and about some estimate of numbers.
Okay. Sure.
Vis-a-vis the rest of the population in Israel.
Fair enough. So, okay, first of all, it depends on our definition of what kind of group, because if we're talking about the landmass that Israel controls, which is from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, including the occupied territories, 12 million people live in that territory, half of them Jewish, half of them Palestinian. Now, Israel considers some of those Palestinian people its own citizens and others not. So it considers all the Jews its own citizens, but Palestinians are only citizens if they're in the Israeli territory, not in the Palestinian territory. Too much time to unpack all that. But the point is that, millions of Palestinian people are dispossessed, don't have the ability to vote for the government that controls their lives. But, so in that landmass of 12 million people, there are also African Palestinians, African folks who lived there prior to the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, the African Bedouin people. But I can't give exact numbers on those. In some towns, they can make up to 10% of the population. It differs, but some of the other African groups in Israel that I can give you specific numbers on, as I mentioned, the African Jews from Ethiopia, they're about 140,000. So in a population, again, of 12 million people from river to the sea, a very small amount of people, 140,000. The amount of African refugees that came from, again, mainly Eritrea and Sudan, in the last 10 years, there were about 66,000 at the peak. Since then, in the last 5 years, the Netanyahu government has ethnically cleansed between a third and a half.
What does that mean?
It means that, as I said, the government's objective was it didn't want to outright deport them back to the countries they fled from, because that would be such a huge violation of international law. It already has such a bad human rights record. It didn't want to do that as well. So instead, the solution, so-called, that they came up with was, let's make their lives miserable so that they end up self-deporting. They just decide, oh, damn it, I forget it. I can't take it anymore. I'm not willing to live on my knees. I'd rather die on my feet. I'll just go back to the country I fled from, and whether they jail me or kill me, or I have to start my life all over again as a refugee in some other European country and try to cross the Mediterranean and maybe drown on the way there. So the government, as I said, ramped up racism and rounds thousands of African folks into this detention center / concentration camp, whatever you want to call it, in the desert, where they're living in a camp. There's no hope on the horizon, and so people, out of despair, often said, okay, fine, send me back. And in this way, by immiserating them and giving them no other choice, jail or back to the country they fled from, or back to Africa, then that's what people elected to do in a lot of cases. Now some people are realizing, if I go back, there's nothing awaiting me there except for more suffering. So you want to jail me? Fine, Israel. Continue to jail me. Keep me in jail. Better that than for me to be tortured by my government. So
yeah,
in any case,
this is true with what black community again? This is like with
these are the African refugees.
The African refugees. So we have like those from Ethiopia who've been there for a long time.
Yeah, a few decades.
Right? So they have a very distinct community. Is that correct?
They do.
And do they have schools for their children? Do they have their own? How does this work? Do they have their own small businesses in their community, or how does that work?
Well, okay. Let's think about some other countries, like here in the United States.
Right.
In Atlanta, in the Atlanta metropolitan area, what percentage of the population is black, would you say? I'm asking you a question now.
That's a good question.
Okay.
I would say that actually
I think the U.S. average is about 12%. Maybe it's higher than that in the South.
Atlanta is much higher. I mean,
Okay.
Atlanta has the major part of the city of Atlanta is majority people of color.
Okay. All right. Cool. So even if it's not even close to a majority, it's at least a significant minority in the United States, without question.
Yeah.
And as a result, it means that even if black folk are catching hell here in all kinds of ways, they at least represent some kind of formidable political force. They can unite and elect their own leaders to Congress, and then those leaders will fight for their rights. And, there's at least some way that they can have a say in the system. But because black folk in Israel are such a small percentage of the population, they have no political power. The political parties don't even try to appeal to their needs, because there's only so many votes that they can get from that in that direction. So sadly, their needs they aren't responded to. They aren't a voting bloc of significance. So what's their existence like? Okay, well, first of all, certainly their immigration wasn't as easy as maybe someone who might have immigrated from, let's say, this former Soviet Union, because Ethiopian folk, before they arrived in Israel, they were mainly farmers and sheep herders and living agricultural lifestyles. So certainly to acclimate to a more technology-based economy represented a challenge. But they're as smart as anyone else, and just like anyone else, they quickly can learn. And the children who were born there, there's no reason why they can't be identical in performance to every other Israeli. The problem is how they were absorbed. The problem is how they were treated. Now, of course, throughout Israel's history, there are some sad stories of how, even from its inception, how Jews of color, were treated by the state. There's so many stories of how, for example, not only, but certainly a lot of families from Yemen, Jews from Yemen who are often have very dark hues in terms of their skin color, the state treated them as disposable, in a sense. They would, in some cases, these babies would be brought to a hospital. Let's say they weren't feeling well and they needed to get a shot or some kind of medicine. The babies would be whisked away from their parents. The parents would be told, "Oh, I'm sorry, your child died. He caught some kind of virus and now he's dead." And then they wouldn't even be told where the child was buried. And in fact, what would happen is these brown babies of Yemenite Jews would be sold, if you can imagine this, to American Jewish families here in the U.S., who, of course, the American Jewish families didn't know whether they were being part of some kind of kidnapping conspiracy. They had no idea. They would pay for these babies. They were, let's say, childless families here in the U.S., or maybe they were child-full families, but they wanted, another child, and so they would pay for the adoption fee.
Is this going on now?
No. This is in the 1950s. But I'm just
see.
explaining to you that there's a long history of the Israeli government treating Jews of color despicably, treating them as cattle, essentially, taking babies from fully functional families, but just because they're brown families, taking their babies and then making a profit on them by selling them to white Jews in America. Not that all Jews in America are white, but those are the families that made those transactions in this case. So my point is that every wave of immigration because there's nativism. It's of course, Israel isn't the only country where nativism is an issue and where white supremacy is an issue, right? But sadly, we see that people who live in a place longer somehow think they're more entitled, than people who just arrived in a country. So immigrants are often exploited. The fact that they were Jewish didn't shield them from this exploitation, and the fact that they were brown and people of color exacerbated it. So this is every immigrant group to Israel has a story of how they suffered when they arrived. Sadly, that's the case. But as I said, these Ethiopian Jews were the most recent wave of immigrants, and they were the darkest skin-colored wave of immigrants, and so their treatment was probably the worst of all the different, or could be the worst of all the different Jewish immigrants to the country. Of course, now we have the first wave of non-Jewish immigrants, the African refugees, and that's 10 times worse. It's by far.
And that's been going on for
A decade. The African refugees started arriving a decade ago.
Yeah, right. And that probably is the result of the Iraq War sort of led to a lot of the destabilization in the area, right? And then North Africa as well. Am I right?
Well, I think that the main, my understanding is that the main reason, now of course what you say is true, and that, also in Syria there's, millions of refugees fleeing Syria. There's a lot of refugee issues to Israel's north and northeast. But these specific refugees migrated to Israel from the south, from sub-Saharan Africa, and the issues there that caused that wave of immigration to head towards Israel was, you may recall that a lot of these refugees head to Europe, and a lot of them were heading to Europe via Libya. They would go north across the Sahara, get to Libya, cross the Mediterranean on a boat. But of course, when this wave of refugees started swelling, the European governments said, hey, we don't want any more brown people if we can help it. So they cut a deal with Gaddafi when he was still in power. And they said, well, if you agreed to stop this flow of refugees, we'll purchase more oil from you and enrich your regime. So
when did they talk to Gaddafi about that?
This is like about 12 years ago.
Okay.
Something to that effect.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. And so at that time, then that essentially stopped the flow of refugees from the East African countries towards Europe. Okay, so that flow of refugees from East Africa through the Sahara to Europe via Libya was cut. And at that point, then instead of going directly north, and they started going northeast. They started going towards Egypt, hoping they'd find refuge there, the next country over after Libya. And in Egypt, sadly, they found horrific treatment as well. The Egyptian regime did not provide them with refuge, just the opposite. At a famous incident right in front of the UN offices in Cairo, there were Sudanese families, hundreds of Sudanese families, begging for protection from the United Nations. Egyptian police came in and just mowed them down, massacred them.
Killed them?
Killed them,
wow.
Men, women, and children.
Now, when was that, you
said? This is like New Year's Eve 2006, or end of 2005. And so at that point, refugees fleeing Darfur and fleeing Sudan started we're not going to we're not going to get anything out of going to Libya, and we're not going to find refuge in Egypt, so the next country over is Israel. And so that's when you see 2006 is when you see the beginnings of this wave of migration towards Israel.
When Israel was founded after the Second World War, it's my understanding that the Israelis were doing what they could to have Jews living in other Middle Eastern countries to come into Israel. And I've heard that the Mossad, for example, in Baghdad was bombing some temples and then blaming the Iraqis for this as a way of forcing Jews into Israel. Do you know about that?
Well, I mean, I've heard that. I've read that. Of course, it's difficult for me.
I've read it too. So, but
yeah,
go ahead.
I try to only speak about things that occurred in my own lifetime, so that I can at least have a sense of, I can verify them with some, or things that I've witnessed myself. But yes, from what I understand, that there were in some cases in some Middle Eastern countries, not only in Iraq but also in Egypt, that there was involvement by Israeli security services or proto-Israeli security, because in some cases they occurred before the State of Israel was created or just afterwards. So security services working for Zionist militias did, in fact, in certain cases, create anti-Semitic attacks or participate in attacks on Jewish centers of prayer or community centers in order to strike fear into the hearts of those Jewish folks, and not to let these people, those regimes, off the hook. Like in some cases, those regimes did harbor anti-Semitic sentiments or did act in ways that made Jewish people feel insecure in their own countries, Iraqi Jews in Iraq. So, but having said that, certainly my understanding is that these Israeli or Zionist security services exacerbated the problem in order to try to make it seem to those Jews living there that there was no chance, there was no way that they could ever continue to live in these countries.
Well, David, one of the reasons I'm asking this question too is that, this is not relative to your living in Israel or the time that you've been living there, but when the Ottoman Empire was existing, it seems to me, from everything I've read, that there was an effort on the part of the Ottoman Empire leadership to have relative peace and respect of those living within the Ottoman Empire. This might be a dream on my part. It's what I've read to a degree. But have you looked at that at all as well? I mean, what I'm saying, once Israel was created, it came in with a different kind of mindset as far as others living in the Middle East were concerned, it seems to me. Am I making sense?
I hear what you're saying. Obviously, it's difficult for me to speak that, but I have a few things to say about that.
Please.
So, I mean, I guess sometimes we have a tendency when things are bad, where we sometimes think back longingly for the times when another empire existed here beforehand, and we forget about all the crimes of that empire, and we think, wouldn't it be great if... And, I mean, there's certainly some things we need to be thankful for. There was a better train system in Israel, Palestine, when the Turks were there. There was, there are certain things that I can say with definitively were better, but some things weren't. And one of those, and for all the good that they probably, I'm sure there was some good that they did, but one of the things that my understanding is that Israel's marriage laws are based on Ottoman marriage laws. Why do I mention this? Because till this day, Israel does not allow civil marriage, and consequentially, it does not allow interracial, interreligious marriage. So that's insane.
Because from the Ottoman period.
Yes, exactly. Because this harkens back to a time when that was how it managed issues of marriage and divorce. So it made it, but that's symptomatic of how the Ottoman Empire ruled its empire, and how perhaps Muslim leaders throughout the last millennia managed their territories, which was to say, true, okay, we're not going to pogrom these Jews, as was often the case in Christian countries or Christian-ruled countries, but what they did was say, okay, we'll rule our affairs and we'll give you Jewish folks your own autonomy. Okay, principle, that sounds great. Hey, everyone controls their own community. But what it means is you give leadership of the community to zealots, essentially. And so what happened was, in some cases, for example, let's say a Jewish girl decided to date a Muslim man. These Jewish rabbis, this is not, I'm not like going to other texts, I'm going to Jewish texts, okay, where they talk about how in those eras, under Muslim rule, when Jewish folks had some level of autonomy, they would have reprisal attacks, where they would send out people to attack people who miscegenated, Jews who miscegenated with non-Jews. What I'm trying to explain is that when one religious group gives supposed autonomy to another religious group and says, well, you can control your own affairs, that's giving control to religious leaders, control over all its so-called civilians. But not everyone wants to live a religious lifestyle. That's why there's atheists and agnostics and secular people, and maybe people who even embrace some aspects of the tradition but not others, and they shouldn't have to be ruled by, so maybe they weren't under the jackboot of the Ottoman Empire, but by, under the system, they were under the jackboot of their own leadership. So my tendency is not to look back and, as if it was a perfect state of affairs. Those times, as amazing as some of some things were, other things weren't, and let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but let's not paint, look through everything through rose-colored glasses too.
So, David, I'm curious to know, what do you hope for in Israel to make the society a more just one toward people of color? What do you hope would happen? Or what are your expectations?
Well, I mean, I confess I don't have high hopes right now. And that's because, in recent years, we've only seen... It's not like... Someone asked me yesterday in an interview, well, is it... Maybe there's going to be a pendulum swing, just like, now we're seeing a swing to the right, then maybe we'll see a swing to the left. And unfortunately, that's not the case in Israel. This has been consistently for the last 15, 20 years. We've seen a continual slide to the right. And with the government, Netanyahu now in power for 9 consecutive years, just about, and every education minister he's appointed has been Orthodox, and they've been, trying to insinuate into the secular education system more and more religious education in the hope that the kids turn out more right-wing with each successive generation. I mean, it's been a success. It's been a smashing success. the youth are more racist than the we think of we would hope that the youth would be less racist than the parents. That's supposedly the trajectory we're aiming for, but in Israel it's the opposite, unfortunately. The government would consider that a success, I'm certain, but for someone like myself who wants to live in a pluralistic society where anti-racism is the norm, then it's disheartening, to say the least. I think part of it is the result of the fact that since the second Intifada, there's the apartheid wall that's been built prevents interactions between Israelis and Palestinians for the most part. So kids who grew up since that time, they may not have any opportunity to even meet a Palestinian person, and goes without saying that's obviously not going to allow them to develop any positive feelings if all they ever hear in the media is negative stuff and they don't even have a way to challenge that with an in-person interaction. But part of it is the racist education system. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting too. So we haven't gone into this, and I don't want to go into it a lot because we don't have a lot of time left here. But what about the Palestinian situation? You're not very hopeful as far as that is concerned as well.
Yeah, well, it's difficult for me to comment on that with any level of expertise, only because I don't speak Arabic. I'll be the first to admit, I don't read or write Arabic. But having said that, I'm monitoring the discourse in Israeli society and in the Knesset and Israel's parliament. And what we see is that, as I said, the whole society is shifting to the right. The right-wing powers, the centrist, the right-wing parties, like Benjamin Netanyahu's party, is veering even further to the far right. And the so-called centrist parties are following them, trying to outflank them from the right. So you see the whole just tilted rightward, the entire political spectrum. If we did an analysis of which parties in the Knesset, in Israel's parliament, we'd see that the nationalist parties and the religious parties account for about 85% of the Knesset seats. So the Progressive Party, let's say, and the Palestinian Party together only amount to 15%. So imagine 15% of the votes in parliament, you don't have any chance of changing things. There's no possibility.
Well, let me ask you this. Why has it moved? Because I witnessed that as well, that of course, I'm not seeing the children. I'm not aware of that in Israel, but I've witnessed it moving further to the right than what was the case a few years ago, it seems to me. Why is that?
It's a good question. I mean, part of it is what I just said, that without the opportunity to even meet Palestinian folks, but it didn't just start only with the apartheid wall being built. Let's take it from the top, okay? You grow up, you're born into a community. Chances are your community is either only Jewish, only Arab. Almost all the communities in Israel have. The government passed a law a few years ago that would allow it to have communities that restrict the admittance of people on the basis of whatever amorphous idea they want, including, obviously, in practice, ethnic group. You can say, oh, we've got our own village, and if you want to live in it, you have to pass an admittance committee. Of course, we, by coincidence, don't allow any Arabs or any black Jews or any gays or any this or any that. And then by the government passing this law, it essentially validates this in the legal system. So if before it only was de facto, now it's de jure. Now that it's like official policy that you can have a Arab-free community, and this can't be challenged in the Supreme Court even. So you grow up in a Jewish-only community. Then you get to school. 99% of schools in Israel are segregated by race or religion. So you don't have even an option. For most people in the country don't have an option of sending their kids to a school that's multicultural, where they can learn another language, or they can meet people of other cultures and other religions. And then in that kind of hothouse, what do you expect when people, are constant? Then let's look at then you grow up and you start to get some media literacy. You start to not only hear things from their teachers and the textbooks and maybe your parents and then what's in the neighborhood, but then you start being exposed to different media outlets, and you're trying to understand what's happening in the country. And 80 something odd % of the media in the country is basically in Netanyahu's pocket. You've got the biggest newspaper in the country that is run at a loss by Netanyahu's backer, Sheldon Adelson, who here from the United States, is the owner of newspapers and casinos, and he runs this newspaper at a loss simply in order to support Benjamin Netanyahu. Then you have the second most popular newspaper in the country, Netanyahu is now being investigated for corruption, for colluding with the publisher of that newspaper, for exchange, for offering in exchange for positive coverage that he would, do favors for the publisher of that newspaper. So with the vast majority of the media in his pocket, what else is going to be reported on but news that favors slanted towards, his perspective? So how many, and of course, it's not like here in the US where you learn, most people are growing up speaking English, and even if the American media is nationalistic and jingoistic and kind of supports the American government foreign wars, but there's still British media, there's still South African media, there's Australian media, there's Irish media, there's all kinds of Canadian, of course, English language media from other countries that you can read so that you can get a fresh perspective on what's happening in the States. Maybe your own media kowtows to the government, but then I'm not doing an analysis of American media, but I'm sure you would say that the mainstream media has a tendency to report on the activities of the government with too much. But the point is that you can look to other countries and at least see how other peoples are reporting. But if the average Israeli person gets their media in Hebrew, there's only one country in the world where Hebrew is the language, the de facto language. So they don't have anywhere else to turn for reflections on other perspectives on what's happening in their country.
Okay, so for a few minutes, I would like to just get some kind of status on the left in Israel.
Okay.
I'm sure there are...
We don't even need a few minutes. They're so small that we don't need a few minutes to talk about them.
So tell us about it.
Yeah. No, of course, I'm not saying that with any joy. It's a sadness, of course.
Yeah, right.
But as I just described, the so-called centrist parties are vying for racist votes. They think that the only way they can get into power is to try to peel off some of those votes from the openly racist parties. So they're starting to embrace some of this racist rhetoric. Yes, as I said, there are some progressive parties, but they amount to such a small fraction of the electorate. Now, of course, there's civil society groups. There's groups that, let's say, document human rights violations against Palestinian people. It's a noble cause, but those groups that do that work, they are demonized by the government. The government calls them traitorous. Okay, they're not human rights groups; they're traitors. It's interesting because on one hand, the same words used to describe them, or some of the same slogans that in darker eras were used to describe Jewish people. Oh, they're stabbing the people in the back. They're traitors, and the same kinds of phrases that was used to justify anti-Semitic pogroms is being used in Israel by the government towards left-wing groups who are trying, with great difficulty, against all odds, to report on human rights violations. So, with that, I'll tell you straight up, I've been on the streets of Tel Aviv, right in front of City Hall, in the most public place in town, filming, and people, just because of how I'm holding a camera in my hand, filming a demonstration, people scream at me, "B'Tselem! B'Tselem!" B'Tselem is one of the human rights groups in Israel that documents human rights violations. So at this point, the government has ramped up the rhetoric, so much hatred towards these human rights groups that people can be sent into a frenzy at the mere mention of their name. And just from holding a camera, people say, "B'Tselem," and I'll be mobbed by people running after me, trying to beat me. This is where we're at, where the human rights groups are so vilified that they're considered traitorous. The left is a tribe unto itself, fighting for its own preservation. Many young people are leaving the country. Admittedly, not all the Israelis leaving the country, young Israelis leaving, are doing so for political reasons. Some of them, have a hard time with the economic situation in the country and maybe other reasons. But for many people on the left, they're like, why, you get to a certain age, you want to settle down, you want to bring kids into the world, and you're like, what options do you have? Where can I raise this child in an environment where they won't grow up to be racist?
Where would they go?
Well, ironically, no small amount are moving to Berlin, because today they see it as,
That's interesting, isn't it?
Very much so. That's what I'm saying. It's like,
Jewish young folks going to Berlin.
Yes, and of course, some of them get to New York, and some in Los Angeles, and some Toronto, and other places around the world. Mm-hmm. But no small amount get to Berlin, partly because, it is a metropolis that's multicultural and forward-looking, and with all of its problems, not trying to gloss over any of the problems in Germany, but at least for many tens of thousands of young Israelis, that's where they're living these years out. and starting new lives, ironically, back in Europe that was so hostile to their forebears just a couple generations ago. That's a sad state of affairs. I mean, I don't think it's sad. I think that Germany is trying to atone. They're in their school system. They're actually teaching about their sordid history, and that's something to praise them for.
Exactly.
So if only in Israel we could own up to the racism that we're perpetuating against Palestinians and others, that would be great. But yeah, it's.
What would it take? Well, we're running out of time here. Well, what would it take for that to happen in Israel?
Wow, it's a good question. Well, because
quickly.
No, of course. There's so wow. Yeah, solve the Middle East in just a minute. All the problems in the Middle East.
Solve all the problems in the Middle East, and explain it in just a minute, David.
Go.
Let me ask you this as a final question.
Okay.
Of course, there are a lot of people around the world who are concerned about what's happening in Israel. So, does the Israeli left get support from other groups around the world?
Well,
not much, I guess.
Look, there are European governments and civil society groups who feel that it's important to support human rights in Israel and Palestine, and so there is some financial support for these groups. But seeing that the government in Israel wants to crush all dissent, it realizes that it has essentially silenced any criticism. Almost every newspaper is afraid to report on its human rights violations. So what it needs to do now is to snuff out those whistleblowers, those witnesses, and often those are Israeli. Not only they're Palestinian people, of course, and we should be listening to Palestinian people speaking about their own being persecuted, but those few Israeli Jews who are reporting on it, the government is now trying to silence them by demonizing them. And so one of the ways it does that is by trying to shut down the funds that they're receiving from European governments, trying to pass laws now saying to constrain the activities of those groups. So if you're getting money from Europe to fund your human rights activities, then we're going to cut you off right there. Yes, there are efforts from Europe to support that. But when Israel tries to cut that off, you don't see the European governments raising a fuss and kicking and screaming. They've essentially allowed themselves to be co-opted in my humble opinion, they've allowed themselves to be co-opted by the Israeli government.
Well, David Sheen, I want to thank you so much for sharing all this with us. It was a very, very unique in so many ways from my experience in learning about what's happening in Israel. So thank you for your great work.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. All your listeners are very welcome at their leisure to check out my website. It's just my name, davidsheen.com. DAVIDSHEEN, and there you'll see links, of course, ways to contact me, but also links to articles and YouTube videos and all kinds of other stuff I've published that'll give you a sense of what I've been talking about, and you can verify it yourself. Don't take my word for it over the airwaves. Check it out and find out for yourselves how dire the situation is, and maybe do something about it.
Thank you.